The city never sleeps, but beneath its bustling streets a different story unfolds. A story whispered in hushed tones, a chilling tale of a phantom subway train. They say it appears at the stroke of midnight, a spectral locomotive devoid of life, yet filled with an eerie, inexplicable presence. Some dismiss it as an urban legend, a figment of imagination fueled by darkness and late-night commutes. But for those who have witnessed it, the memory lingers, a chilling reminder that some things can't be rationally explained. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sterile glow on the nearly deserted platform. John, a young man with tired eyes and a worn-out paperback in hand, checked his watch impatiently. It was past midnight, the last train of the night nowhere in sight. He was used to the city's nocturnal rhythms, the ebb and flow of life that continued even after the sun went down. But tonight, an unusual stillness hung in the air, a palpable tension that sent shivers down his spine. The screech of arriving trains was a familiar sound, a comforting reminder of the city's pulse. But tonight, the silence was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water seeping from the grimy tiled walls. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, pregnant with unseen possibilities. Minutes stretched into an eternity as John paced the platform, his unease growing with each passing moment. He glanced at the graffiti-marred walls, the shadows seeming to writhe and twist in his peripheral vision. A cold draft swept through the station, swirling around him like an unseen specter. He pulled his jacket tighter, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that had taken root in his gut. The echoes of distant footsteps reverberated through the tunnel, a phantom rhythm that sent chills down his spine. He strained to listen, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The rhythmic click-clack grew louder, closer, raising goosebumps on his arms. A train was approaching, but it wasn't the familiar rumble of the last train. This one sounded different, older, its sound laced with an unnatural metallic screech. A faint light appeared in the distance, growing steadily brighter. It was a small, almost imperceptible glimmer at first, barely noticeable against the oppressive darkness that surrounded it. But as the seconds ticked by, the light began to grow, pushing back the shadows and illuminating the cold, damp walls of the tunnel. It was as if the tunnel itself was coming to life, awakening from a long, deep slumber. It wasn't the warm, inviting glow of an approaching train, but a cold, spectral luminescence that seemed to suck the color from the tunnel. The light was eerie, almost otherworldly, casting long, twisted shadows that danced and flickered on the walls. It was a light that seemed to drain the very life from the air, leaving behind a chilling, almost suffocating atmosphere. The tunnel, once a place of mundane transit, had transformed into a realm of ghostly apparitions and unsettling silence. As it drew closer, John could make out the outline of a train, its shape distorted and hazy, as if viewed through a veil of fog. The train seemed to waver and shimmer, its edges blurring and shifting like a mirage. It was a sight that defied logic, a spectral vision that sent a shiver down his spine. The train's windows were dark, impenetrable voids that seemed to swallow the light, adding to the sense of dread that gripped him. Panic clawed at his throat, urging him to flee. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a drum of impending doom. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, cold and clammy against his skin. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, to escape the unnatural horror that was bearing down on him. But his body refused to obey, paralyzed by a fear that was as irrational as it was overwhelming. But his feet seemed rooted to the spot, frozen by a fear so profound it bordered on hypnotic. It was as if an invisible force held him in place, compelling him to witness the approaching terror. His mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions, but his body remained still, locked in a state of paralysis. The tunnel seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in, the air growing thicker and more oppressive with each passing second. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of mildew and something else, something ancient and unnameable. It was a smell that seemed to seep into his very soul, a miasma of decay and despair. The tunnel was alive with the sounds of dripping water and the distant echoes of unseen creatures, adding to the sense of unease that gripped him. It was a place that felt forgotten by time, a relic of a bygone era that had been left to rot in the darkness. The sound of the approaching train intensified, a deafening, grinding cacophony that reverberated in his chest, making his teeth ache. It was a noise that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth, a primal roar that shook the tunnel to its foundations. The sound was relentless, a constant assault on his senses that left him feeling disoriented and overwhelmed. It was as if the train was a living entity, a beast of metal and steam that was intent on consuming everything in its path. He wanted to scream, to run, but his voice was trapped in his throat, his body paralyzed by a primal fear he'd never known. It was a fear that went beyond the rationale, a deep-seated terror that seemed to tap into the very core of his being. His mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion, but his body remained frozen, unable to move or make a sound. The tunnel, the train, the darkness, they all seemed to conspire against him, trapping him in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Section 5. The Train of No Faces. The train screeched to a halt, its brakes groaning like the death rattle of some monstrous beast. The sound echoed through the empty station, amplifying the sense of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. John could feel the vibrations under his feet, a reminder of the immense power and weight of the machine that had just arrived. John stared in horror as its doors hissed open, revealing an empty, dimly lit interior. The lights inside flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. It was as if the train itself was alive, breathing in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. He peered into the windows, his breath fogging the grimy glass, but saw no reflection staring back at him. The absence of any human presence was unnerving, as if the train had swallowed its passengers whole, leaving behind only an empty shell. The train was devoid of life, yet it pulsed with an eerie, unsettling energy, as if it were a living entity, aware of his presence. The seats were empty, but the air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the train was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He could feel its gaze upon him, cold and calculating, like the eyes of a predator sizing up its prey. The sensation was almost tangible, a chilling presence that sent shivers down his spine. It was as if the train was alive, and it had chosen him as its next target. His instinct screamed at him to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this ghostly apparition, but his legs felt like lead, weighed down by an invisible force that kept him rooted to the spot. Every fiber of his being urged him to flee, yet he remained frozen in place. But the fear that had rooted him to the spot held him captive, a prisoner of his own terror. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and frantic, echoing in his ears. The train seemed to be waiting, its doors still open, as if inviting him to step inside and face whatever horrors lay within. The choice was his, but the fear was overwhelming, paralyzing him in its icy grip. Section 6. Frozen with fear. The train's doors hissed shut with a finality that sent shivers down his spine. The sound echoed in the empty station, a chilling reminder that he was now sealed inside this metal beast, cut off from the world outside. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was conspiring to heighten his sense of dread. He was trapped, alone with whatever malevolent entity inhabited this spectral train. The seats, once filled with the hustle and bustle of daily commuters, now seemed like silent sentinels, watching his every move. Each shadow cast by the dim, flickering lights seemed to dance with a life of its own, adding to the eerie ambiance. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic thump of his heart. Every breath he took seemed to echo back at him, amplifying his fear. He could almost hear the blood rushing through his veins, a constant reminder of his vulnerability in this ghostly setting. He wanted to close his eyes, to shut out the sight of the empty train, but some primal instinct kept them wide open, alert for any sign of movement. His eyes darted from one corner to another, searching for any hint of danger. The fear was palpable, a living, breathing entity that seemed to wrap itself around him, refusing to let go. Suddenly, the train lurched forward, its movement jerky and unnatural like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. The sudden motion threw him off balance and he grabbed onto a nearby pole to steady himself. The train's erratic movements only served to heighten his sense of unease, making him feel like a marionette in a sinister play. John stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. Each beat felt like a hammer striking an anvil, reverberating through his entire body. He clutched his chest, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging within him. The fear was almost paralyzing, making it difficult to think clearly. The train began to move faster, its wheels grinding against the tracks with an ear-splitting screech. The sound was almost unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, and it seemed to pierce through his very soul. The faster the train went, the more his anxiety grew, feeding off the relentless noise. It picked up speed until it was nothing more than a blur of cold white light disappearing into the darkness. The tunnel seemed to swallow the train whole, leaving behind an eerie silence that was almost as unsettling as the noise. John could only hope that this nightmare would end soon, but deep down, he knew that the worst was yet to come. Section 7. A desperate escape. John didn't hesitate. He ran. He ran like he'd never run before, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. The image of the empty train, its spectral glow and the chilling silence within its carriages fueled his flight. He didn't dare look back, afraid of what he might see. The echoes of his own footsteps mingled with the phantom rumble of the disappearing train, creating a terrifying symphony of sound that chased him through the darkness. He emerged onto the platform, gasping for breath, his clothes soaked in a cold sweat. The familiar sights and sounds of the station were a welcome relief, a return to a reality he had momentarily doubted. He leaned against the wall, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to process the terrifying encounter. Section 8. Back to reality. He waited, his heart still pounding until he heard the familiar rumble of the real last train approaching. As its doors hissed open, he stumbled inside, collapsing onto a seat, his body trembling with exhaustion and residual fear. The other passengers, weary commuters lost in their own thoughts, paid him no mind. They were oblivious to the horror he had just witnessed, the chilling encounter that had shaken him to his core. As the train pulled away from the station, he risked a glance back at the dark tunnel, half expecting to see the spectral train emerge from its depths. But there was nothing there, only darkness and the echo of his own fear. Section 9. The lingering dread. John never spoke of his experience, knowing that no one would believe him, but the memory of that night, the chilling encounter with the phantom train, stayed with him, a constant shadow lurking at the edge of his thoughts. He continued to ride the subway, the city's underground arteries, a necessary evil in his daily commute. But he never again stayed at a station past midnight, always choosing to leave well before the clock struck 12. And whenever he found himself alone on a platform, the silence seemed to whisper a chilling reminder: the city never sleeps, and some legends, it seems, are more than just stories.